What's up guys? So we're going to run through some variations for training the external rotators of the shoulder. One of the things we want to consider with the shoulder in the anatomy of the external rotators is the way they attach, coming across from the scapula onto that upper arm. Changing the position of the upper arm is going to have a big impact on the ranges of that, being able to train that through its full range. So a lot of people will only ever train the external rotators from this position. They'll also be using something like a dumbbell. And if we were to give Brian a dumbbell, what we're actually dealing with here is an axis of rotation in the shoulder that's in this, this plane here, and that line of force in the dumbbell is also challenging that plane, going in that direction as well, which is actually creating a challenge to this axis in the elbow, meaning that's actually a bicep challenge. There's no actual challenge to this plane of rotation for the external rotators. So that is kind of a redundant exercise for external rotation. If you're going to be able to, if you're going to train the external rotators in this plane, you're going to want a line of force that is essentially creating a challenge to that axis, which would mean using a cable like so. So if Ryan was to use this cable here, we're now creating a moment arm to that shoulder in that plane of motion using this using the cable directed. So what Ryan's got to think about here though is creating a lot of compression within this, driving his elbow into his side, so that we're essentially not, if he starts pulling away from his elbow like that, he's going to start recruiting some of that lateral deltoid. So essentially what he's got to think about is driving that elbow into his side hard, creating a lot of stability through his scapula, and then cueing these guys through the back of it, the top of his back here, and leading into his upper arm, those external rotators to create all the motion. What he's also dealing with, which you might not be able to see from this angle, is that as he's getting into this position, that moment arm isn't really changing with regards to the cable, that line of force. So it's actually getting quite hard in that position where he's getting quite weak. So what he can actually manually change that himself, where as he gets into that position, he's going to pull that cable towards him slightly like he's doing here. And that's actually going to create a bit of a drop-off with regards to that line of force. Therefore, the challenge is actually going to get easier as he's getting into a weaker position for those external rotators. So that's basically one position. We might chuck a little clip from the side on at the end where you can see what he's actually doing with the cable there. So if you drop that back. So the other position we're going to think about is that these external rotators are going to function throughout all these ranges up here, even into our overhead position, but given the anatomy of the scapula, the glenohumeral joint itself, the range gets quite restricted as we go overhead. So really, we're only going to worry hugely about training it into this position here. But all these points in between, you should be able to at some point to create challenges using cables and stuff where you can, train these guys in this position. One of the ways we can do that is if Ryan sets up with his left. We're using the Cybex Bravo cables because they've got this extendable pad here, which he can then create that support the same way he was thinking about driving his arm in here and compressing that into the side of his body, creating support at that end of the joint. He's able to do it here with the extendable pad. And again, you can be able to see it more clearly here. As he's getting into that position up here, we're still dealing with the axis of rotation here. That line of force is actually getting even further away from the axis in terms of that moment arm. So that's getting pretty damn hard, and again in a position where he's very, very weak. He's also approaching his closed pack position of his glenohumeral joint, which is potentially a position we might want to stay a little bit clear of if we're thinking about joint integrity. So we've actually brought him out of that a little bit. He could be standing a little bit more side on like that. That would be closer to his closed pack position as he gets into that full range of external rotation. So we've essentially adducted his arm a little bit by changing his position. And then what he's thinking about here, the same idea, is he can then manually offload that himself by pulling that cable down towards the thing. So you can think we've essentially reduced that moment arm as he's getting into a shortened position. But again, we're able to train these external rotators in a very stable environment and not put too much through them, and also not neglect certain parts of the range. By keeping it like this, there's somewhat of an equal challenge through most of the range we're training, which is in terms of creating a full range challenge, creating full range stimulation to those muscles. It's going to have a much greater carryover to improving strength in the long term. But yeah, those are just some some easy options for you guys to set up. If you don't have access to the Cybex Bravo, you could use a bench. You just put the bench up and use that. You could use your other arm to create the same level of support, but then you would lack the ability to play with that cable and alter that line of force.